My name is Graham Nicholls. Welcome to a special edition of the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. I am joined by my normal co-presenter, Lizzie Harewood. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello, Graham.
Are you excited about the election?
I'm really excited, actually. Yeah, I was not expecting it this soon. I had my my bet. If I was a betting lady, I would have said autumn. But so this was quite a surprise yesterday. Waiting on tenterhooks, watching the BBC News channel. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm glad you're excited. I'm not sure I can describe my emotion as excited. I do like election nights, but, like through the night and all that kind of little drama, but I don't know. We'll develop that as we discuss. But we have a special guest who's a returning guest, James Mildred from Care. Welcome, James.
Great to be with you. And can I just add to that, Graham, that I am not only excited for election night, but also excited for every day that comes between now and election night. It's just full excitement.
What is it that actually excites you about it?
Well, I'm someone who gets bored very quickly, so this is a change from the normal routine. So I love that. I thought yesterday, or rather Wednesday, the 22nd of May, when we had all of the drama and there was a febrile atmosphere in Westminster, I love all of that. And you just got a sense that this time it really was different, and you had cabinet ministers called back and all of that. And I thought that was great. And also, I think this is something that at Care we have been working on for a very long time. In preparation for an election being called at any point this year. And so we have got a fantastic offer, I think, for the church in terms of equipping Christians. And I'm just excited to get that launched and hopefully to really serve the church over the next 6 weeks ahead of polling day on 4th of July or Independence Day for our American cousins.
James, were you surprised at how soon Rishi Sunak called this election? Were you thinking it could be later?
I mean, I think, yes, I was thinking it could be later. I have had a terrible track record of predicting big political moments over the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years. I called the Scottish independence referendum wrong. I called Brexit wrong. I got the last two general elections wrong. So I've learned from that bitter experience never to trust my instincts. And my instincts were telling me autumn. So I was sort of waiting, expecting something else to happen, almost because I was like, I don't want to trust myself on this one. I think there's no doubt in my mind, from chatting to a couple of candidates that I know and also a couple of MP contacts as well, there's no doubt at all that this is a big surprise. And even though there were rumours that maybe a summer election, it wasn't being taken massively seriously. And you can kind of see the logic behind an autumn election. Why not give it as long as possible in the hope that you might even get another tax cut past the docket? You might hope, hopefully people start to feel inflation coming down in terms of their daily lives. But I also think that Rishi Sunak is somebody who really resents it when people suggest that he's not very bold, when people suggest that he's sort of a bit timid, not very political. And there is a slight feeling, one commentator I listened to this morning said, there's a slight feeling of, here he is, this is his kind of like ripping his shirt moment, kind of like, look at me, I'm bold, I've got a big plan kind of thing. So maybe that's what's going on as well, but time will tell.
Yeah. Well, just leaving the politics to one side for a moment of it, or the politics and the intrigue and the drama, which is part of what draws us in. It's a bit like sporting events and everything else. There's a beauty of the technicality of a game, but there's also the drama of a game, isn't there? Big picture, what's happening, James, in terms of God and politics and people rising and falling? What's going on?
Well, it's exactly as you just said, if I'm honest with you, Graham. One of the things I love about the Bible and that picture of God that you just outlined is, I think it was Spurgeon who described the doctrine of God's sovereignty as like a pillow on which Christians can just lay our heads. I it's a fantastic picture because I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. I certainly don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be, though I can hazard many a guess. But it's amazing to go into this election knowing that God knows. And then Romans 13 tells me that all authority is given by God. So his will shall be done in this election. And for me personally, depending on whichever way I end up voting, or you vote, or Lizzie votes, I think it's incredible to think through that reality, that ultimately God is the one who's going to bring about the government of his choosing. And I also think that can really help me in terms of motivation to engage. That actually safe in the knowledge that this is under God's providential sovereign control. I have freedom to engage. And if I'm disappointed on the 5th of July, it's okay. There's that idea in that politics is important, but it's not ultimate. And that realization, that knowledge, that theology, I think, if I was going into this election, for example, not really believing, not having a high view of the sovereignty of God, then I think I would be at the mercy of more doubts, more fears, more anxiety. And it's interesting, isn't it? This whole narrative that's been pushed in this election of this has never been a more dangerous moment for Britain. And, you've got to trust me to navigate us to security. I sort of think as a Christian, I can kind of go, it is a dangerous moment. There's lots of dangers in the world, but I trust in God. So there's that whole dynamic as well. So yeah, we'll see. That's what I think is the kind of big picture.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. I think sometimes we forget that for the now. We can see it in, I don't know, King Nebuchadnezzar or people in the Old Testament. We think, oh yeah, God, puts him in power, then he can depose him in a moment. But we kind of, because we're into the whole intrigue and the all the social reasons or sociological reasons why parties come in, parties go out, and all the rest of it, we just think it's just a human process and it's a natural process, where actually it's a God process. So I think it's really helpful to get that perspective. So we're into an election. You two are excited. Would I had one of my funky questions, which was, would Jesus have voted, and should we vote?
Oh, man. Lizzie? Would Jesus have voted?
Oh, goodness. The problem is, if you say yes, you then have to say, well, who would he have voted for?
Yeah.
So I think it's probably not helpful to ask these hypothetical questions, Graham.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I back Lizzie on that, Graham. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I actually had in my mind a different question, which was like, someone would Paul have voted or whatever else. But then I thought, now let's put it to the highest authority, would Jesus have voted? I think it's reasonable as a silly hypothetical to say that on the basis of him talking about paying taxes to Caesar, I think he would, as a responsible citizen. I think get me a coin, whose head and so forth, paying taxes to Caesar is a kind of an equivalent of what we're doing in voting. So I think he would have voted. I don't think he would have encouraged dropping out. What do you reckon, James?
Well, I've got a major problem if I say no. A bit like what Lizzie was saying, because at CARE, we use the line all the time. An election is an opportunity for Christians, for the church, to be salt and light in our world. And of course, we are only salt and light because we are united to Jesus, who is the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And so if I'm saying that's a rationale for us engaging in us, and I would go as far as to say, this is my personal view, I'm not at this point reflecting the specific view of the organization I work for. CARE would take the view that Christians should vote and should be engaged and all of that. I would go as far as to say, I think it is wrong if we don't exercise our democratic right and privilege in this election. In Australia, for example, if you don't vote, you are fined for not doing so, because it is considered such a privilege and such a high civic duty. We can debate whether fines should be introduced for non-voting, but to me, it's one of the amazing witnesses of the church, and recent research indicates that Christians, by and large, will vote, in distinction to the wider society, where as much as 40% of eligible voters might not turn up and cast their vote in an election. That is just mind-boggling to me. But maybe I'm being naive. Maybe I should try and understand more about why that is. But so I think, Jesus, I'm gonna have to say he would vote, because where we come from at CARE.
Yeah, just drill a little bit further into that to tell me why. You said it's a privilege and so forth. It should be a responsibility. I pretty much agree with you. I think mandatory voting would be a good idea, and may get a more representative result actually of what people actually think. But anyway, that's a disputable point. But why? Drill a bit further down into the why we should vote.
I think there's two things I would say. The first thing is, by voting, then I am passing my judgment on my local MP, the candidates who stand in my local constituency. And because I'm able to do that, I'm able to hold them to that ultimate account, that my vote, along with the votes of others in the constituency, might even lead to a sitting MP who we're not happy with losing their seat and no longer being able to represent the constituency, and another candidate takes their place. And that privilege, that position of holding my MP to account, or indeed backing my MP if I've been happy with what they've done in the constituency over the last 5 years, I think is hugely important for how our democracy functions, how our parliament works. And if I'm commanded, and I am, to love my neighbour as myself, then surely it is my Christian duty to care about the policies that are enacted in Westminster, because this is a point we make again and again at CARE, and we'll never stop making it. The connection between politics and people, the fact that when you strip away all of the intrigue and the drama and the high politics that so often takes up our time and attention, then what is happening in Westminster? What are MPs there ultimately to do? They are there ultimately as a big part of their job to scrutinise legislation, to pass amendments, to make legislation better, and all legislation from the most mundane to the most dramatic, all of it has an impact on my neighbour and the people in my constituency. And the more that we can get into that way of thinking, that this election is about people, it's about human beings made in God's image, I think that even just as I'd say that, I think, gosh, actually, this is a weighty responsibility. And that then takes me into the fact that I want to challenge Christians in this election. Don't just vote how you voted before, because that's how you always vote. Be willing to wipe the slate clean and approach this, as it were, as if you were voting for the very first time. I think that would be a fantastic mindset to go into this election.
That is great.
I think that's a great point, James. I was struck there the way that you spoke so much about your constituency and your local MP. I'm wondering, as we approach this election, should that be our priority? I mean, obviously, when you go to vote, you cast your vote at the however you do it, at the ballot box. You vote for your local candidate. However, in reality, many people will see which party they are associated with. Should we vote on party allegiance? Should we vote for a local MP because they may have particular characteristics or stand up for particular things, even if the wider party has some what we might perceive to be problematic policies?
That's a fantastic couple of questions. Firstly, I would say that little mini rant is coming right now. Because of what's happened in America, because of the way the American election works, which most of us here, if we're interested in politics, also are interested in, that is a presidential election, which means there are two people on the docket, and it's a very simple, straight up fight between one or the other. And I think the way that the media works here is that, and the way that the parties work and the way that campaigns work, is the presidentializing of our national general election campaigns means that I think a lot of people do go and they vote on the basis of, I prefer Rishi Sunak, I prefer Keir Starmer, etc., etc. And I want to stress that I'm not saying that that is entirely illegitimate when it comes to casting your votes, that you have an interest in who becomes the most senior minister in the country, because the influence the Prime Minister yields in our governmental system is significant. However, the way our democracy works is you are voting for your local representative. And so that means I've got some freedom, because to answer the second part of the question, I think that means if I look at my candidates and there's, let's say, a Labour Party candidate, and I particularly like what they've said about the things they want to do in the constituency, I feel like they are sincere, they've got integrity. I've got questions about some of the moral character of some of the other candidates, but the Labour Party candidate really stands out. They seem sincere. I like what they're saying, etc., etc. And yet I'm very nervous about what the Labour Party in the round might do if they come into power. So I think that I've got freedom in that situation, and I think it's justifiable to go, I'm going to set aside my bigger concern and I'm going to vote purely on the local level, because that candidate has really stood out for me. And that gives me some flexibility in terms of where I cast my vote. If you go the other way and go, I really liked the Labour or rather, I didn't like the Labour candidate, but I love the party. I love the big picture. I love Keir Starmer. I think he's fantastic. So I'm going to hold my nose. I'm going to vote for my local Labour Party candidate, for example, or Tory Party candidate, whatever. Then again, I think we have freedom in Christ to exercise our judgment one way or the other. But I think for me, something I'm always saying to friends and family is, the media are going to push this as a presidential campaign while commenting that, it's a very presidential campaign. Yes, presidential campaign because you make it a presidential campaign. However, our job is let's get local. And again, just to caveat that, don't forget the national picture because I don't think that's unimportant. But I would say, you're voting for your local representative. And then just to throw in a third spanner in the works, what happens if one of the candidates, you don't like the party, but they're a Christian and that they love Jesus? Then again, I think it's legitimate. You could jettison your normal political allegiances and be like, I'm going to vote for my brother or sister in Christ. So,
What about ethical voting? Is that something that as a Christian we should ever be tempted to partake in?
I think I more and more coming to the view that I'm a max freedom kind of guy when it comes to these kind of questions. I just think, you've got to decide yourself or in council with others for your local area. I think tactical voting is a legitimate means to achieve a worthy end if that's what you want to do. Actually, this is a question I would sort of push back to all of us. One question that I was asked in a seminar that has stayed with me recently, a couple of months ago. So doing an election seminar in a church, and it was going great, and I had Q&A, and the questioner just asked me the question, and this is all great, I agree with it all, but it can come across very much as like a kind of quite a selfish thing, like it's me and my vote, and therefore surely when it comes to voting, how do I turn voting into something that is more about other people? And I found that just a really interesting challenge because so much of the narrative is, it's your vote and it's no one else's vote and no one's allowed to, they charities can't influence you and that kind of thing. And you've got to make your mind up and you've got to, and I just thought, I wonder if that rhetoric can lead us into a kind of a tunnel vision where it doesn't really matter what anyone else thinks. It's just me and my vote and my decision. And I guess he was sort of just wrestling with, can that be a bit selfish? I found it a really interesting challenge. I don't know what you both think.
I think that seems like such a distinctively Christian question to ask, doesn't it? In that love for our neighbour should be one of the predominant things that motivates us to vote. And often we can be thinking, well, how can we protect Christian rights in society, which of course is not it's not a bad thing to want to aspire to, of course not. However, I wonder how that kind of plays off with some of the other considerations we should have for those that are even more vulnerable, or those just the general populace. I think I think that's a great challenge. Absolutely. Graham, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think with James there is a great deal of freedom about this in all these areas. We have a Christian candidate where I'm likely to vote, in the area I'm likely to vote if I'm still alive and living here on July the 4th. So that is the dilemma. A Christian that I know who's a candidate, should I vote for them rather than someone else? But in terms of the selfishness, I think it's a really good corrective to say what's motivating you in voting. I think it's not wrong to say I've got a responsibility and it is my vote and it is something that I personally have to, taking counsel from others and family members or church members, I can do that. But in the end, I do have to take responsibility for my vote. It's so not so much being selfish or self-centered in saying that. It's my vote and I'm going to vote for what financially or conveniently creates the best environment for me. I think that's where it becomes selfish.
Mm-hmm. So it's more using your vote responsibly.
I think so. And what we think responsibly is good for the locality or good for the country. Just to connect it with that, because I think this local versus national is significant. it might even help with this a little bit. Someone threw a question to me today that someone else in a community group type meeting last night had said, surely no Christian can look another Christian in the eye and say they voted for a party or a person who allows abortion or is silent about abortion. And I gave a series of answers to say that I think it's more nuanced than that, but I'd be interested in your guys' thoughts on that. You know, whether you, in weighing all the moral issues, particularly, let alone the economic ones and sort of tactical ones, in weighing up moral issues, do you kind of rate them all and say, well, who's got the least bad moral position, or is it more complex than that? Could you vote for a party that supports abortion? You know, how do you decide that it's okay to do that?
Can I just jump in there? Because I would say that this is also, so we had our church a couple of weeks ago, and we had a talk by my husband actually on voting priorities. And I would say that the question that was asked most frequently was the abortion question. So this certainly does resonate with people in church. It seems to be quite a priority. And to be honest, it is for me as well, something I'm particularly concerned about.
I think with news just out in recent days as well, that there's been a record number of abortions that have taken place, highest ever figure that's been recorded. That has been the trend, sadly, for a long time. I think also the fact that there's in the background the ongoing prospect of a legal wrangle and parliamentary battle over what's called the decriminalisation of abortion, where you remove all remaining legal safeguards and you make abortion all the more widely available. I think it makes complete sense that Christians who care deeply about the value of life and the fact that life begins at conception, the fact that, you know, God formed us in our mother's wombs and all of that. I mean, I think for me, again, to apply the freedom principle of the freedom we have in Christ, which I'm bound to say is a distinctive Baptist contribution to Christian theology and Christian understanding. Now, that's the final Baptist point I will make on this particular podcast. I think with that freedom, I think it's absolutely legitimate for Christians to prioritize the abortion issue if that is under God, according to their conscience, what they feel is the moral issue they should be voting on. I think where I get slightly more nervous is where Christians can give the impression, as perhaps that comment did, that there is there's a moral hierarchy where that issue somehow is more significant and higher up the agenda than others. Because the truth is that when it comes to the different causes, the different issues that we might vote upon, for example, I might take the issue of economic justice in my local constituency very seriously. It might trouble me greatly that in my constituency, there are more than 25,000 children who are living under the poverty line. And that places them at risk of dying and death. And okay, in one sense, might not be as tangible in terms of the abortion issue, but I don't see how I could draw a moral hierarchy or a hierarchy of rights. In the Christian worldview, there shouldn't be a hierarchy of rights. In other words, that situation, that issue of children under the poverty line and all that that means for their life chances, if that burdens me, for example, more than the abortion issue, that doesn't make me a sinner. It doesn't mean that I've morally failed. I think that God places different causes and issues on our hearts into different intensities. And therefore, when the church collectively, again, this comes back to we're not just individuals, we are part of a body. When the church goes to vote, I want people voting who care deeply about the abortion issue, who care deeply about economic justice, who care deeply about creation care, who care deeply about, you know, a fair immigration system and all of that. I wonder whether to remember that there is that bigger picture. And I think, again, to put it another way, I think if a Christian said, you know, I don't really care about the abortion issue, that just doesn't you know, impact. I think that language, if it's intentionally chosen, that would bother me. How can you say you don't care about what has happened in our country over the last 5-6 decades when it comes to abortion law? So it's hard, isn't it? Because when someone says that, you can feel, even when they say it, oh, gosh, yeah, you're right. That is, that's, and I would just urge caution, I suppose, and also a wider perspective, a wider lens. And I don't think that is downplaying the significance of the abortion issue at all.
I think there's the wider lens issue, but I think there's also the practical issue that none of the parties likely to lead or to have a significant role, or even to win any seats at all, are putting forward an anti-abortion platform.
Yeah.
So that's not to say it doesn't matter, but it grieves us greatly. But it does mean you don't really have a choice. You could vote for a minority party that perhaps had that in their manifesto. But it may not have a lot of use. And I think why I connected it with the local thing is that if you have a local candidate that you can speak to, you can at least try and influence at every point the votes on these, even though their party may have a different view. And, often parties give free votes on these kind of issues. So although the party policy may be not to change the law on abortion, for example, or if they change it to make it worse, an individual may well be biddable to persuade them to at least try and stem the tide of evil in some way. So I think weighing up, is this person locally someone I can talk to, someone who's listening to me, or are they a sort of very career minded and couldn't care less about their locality? So I think that becomes significant. And
I think on that, Graham, on that very quickly, I think you've raised a really helpful point as well, just practically for Christians listening and watching this. I think very often we can vote almost entirely on the causes, and I would say that's good. Take that seriously, but also you've raised, I think, a question of moral character as well, and I think that biblical emphasis on the importance of character. That's why getting, if you can, some information on your candidates, whether that's through the literature, whether that's through social media, or whether that's, if there is a church-based hustings going on, or even a hustings going on in your area, it's a great chance to go and ask the questions that perhaps others won't ask, as well as asking some of those common ground questions as well. So I think that's a good point, and seeing the candidates in action allows us to draw at least some observations about their moral character.
So, James, can you give us a bit of a timeline now? So, obviously, next week, I believe Parliament's going to be dissolved. And that means that MPs are going to cease to be MPs, and they're going to be prospective parliamentary candidates. So, what can we do now to engage with them? They're going to be pounding the streets, knocking on doors, doing all kinds of things to promote their candidacy. How can we get in touch? I mean, will an email help? What do we go and find them? Do we answer the door to anyone who knocks?
So I guess there's a multifaceted way that you can kind of find out what candidates think and engage. So the most basic stuff's going to come through your letterbox, and rather than putting it straight in recycling, have a read of it. You'll find contact details on that literature, so you can follow up with specific questions. And if you want examples of some great questions to ask on a range of causes, we've got that on our Engage 24 general election website. I think definitely think about going along to a hustings. We've got an interactive map on our website where we're going to plot in as many church-based hustings as we can find. But I think check out local Facebook groups, social media groups for your area. They often advertise things like hustings if it's taking place in a non-church setting. I think you can go on the internet and you can find information about your candidates. It is readily available. Even just type in candidate standing in and then your constituency. And if you don't know your constituency, use your postcode and type that in and say, what parliamentary constituency is this postcode in? You'll find that, and then you can find the candidates. And from there, you can get access to their email addresses and their contact details. And you can, again, approach them via email if you wish, or write to them if you so wish, or even just message them via social media as well. And that gives you a chance to ask some of the questions. If you go to a hustings, you can ask more questions. So I think it's a kind of, there's so many ways you can do it. I think it's just picking whichever one works best for you. And I think the other thing I'd say is this is a good time to keep an eye on the news. If you're not watching it on a regular basis normally, maybe you just watch it. Just keep a slightly bigger eye on it, as it were, because a lot of information will travel around in terms of the national campaign, in terms of the big kind of lines that are coming out of the parties. And I think I'd encourage us to be as engaged as possible. And again, one of the things we tried to do at CARE with our election website, engage24.org.uk, is we've really tried to provide as much information as we can about where the parties are coming from on the big issues. When the manifestos come, we'll analyse them from a Christian perspective, but we've also got candidate information. So you can type your postcode in, and we've done the hard yards of kind of gathering as much data as we can. I think if memory serves me right, that particular function will be developed as the campaign goes on. So all of that is just there to serve you and help you engage well.
That's excellent. And I have to say, I did advise people I was in a meeting with last night to go and have a look at that website. So I'm looking forward to checking that out over the next couple of days.
Yeah, well, I don't know where this podcast is landing, but just for clarity's sake, we are launching the website on the 23rd of May, and it will be live then until polling day, and probably beyond that as well. So yeah, engage24.org.uk.
We are launching this podcast on the 23rd of May as well.
How about that? I guess timing. We're at the moment we're working towards a 6 o'clock launch, so depends when the podcast lands.
Yeah, midnight probably. Now, is there I mean, it's really hard to say what is a Christian issue, in a sense that, you analyze it from a Christian point of view. Every policy, in a sense, has a Christian perspective on it. But although I'm with you in that there's not necessarily a hierarchy, there's certainly a category of things like murder, abortion, and marriage, and others, where you'd say there's the clear Christian perspective on. There are other where there's a clear Christian view on, but maybe not a very black and white specific command, say to do with how we deal with refugees, or general matters of justice, and how justice is served, and how we care for vulnerable in society, and so on. But different ways of achieving that. But then when it comes to maybe judgments about what might work economically, that's in another category again, or I don't know what a speed limit should be. So there's a principle, which is we want to preserve life, and then there's a sort of practice about what preserves life the best, and trades off preserving life with people being able to get to destinations and so on. So in your analysis, or in what you think we should be thinking as Christians, although not a simple hierarchy, a crude hierarchy, there is a bit of a tapering off, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And I think, for example, we've been preaching through in our Sunday evening services the 10 Commandments, which I think is a good starting point, because there's a very concise summary there. Now, I mean, I'm going to say this guardedly. Obviously, you want to be careful with that. You want to understand the commandments in their proper context. But particularly the second table, honoring father and mother, and so on, I think those commands are generally viewed as being to do with how we relate to one another. I think that gives you a really important kind of starting point in terms of assessing, what are the policy issues where the Bible is very clear? So do not murder, you said, do not steal, and do not covet, so on. I think we also have to remember, go back to Genesis, go back to the beginning, look at things like the value of life from human beings made in God's image, also the importance and dignity of work, the importance of rest, in terms of a balance between work and rest. Also look at things like marriage, you mentioned, and the importance of family as well. Again, there from the very beginning, because what that tells us is that those institutions, family, marriage, work and rest, they're part of God's good design for this world. And yes, they're tainted by sin, but those institutions are still hugely significant. I think also, I think when it comes to issues around freedom and gospel freedom, I think that belongs in that category where I think it's clear from the Bible, 1 Timothy 2, why are we to pray for those in authority? It's so that we can lead godly, holy lives in gospel freedom. So more people are saved, not denying God, can save people and does amazing things in countries where the gospel is, humanly speaking, locked out. But I think, the freedom issue, and again, from that issue, it's not just religious freedom for Christians, it's also freedom for all people to be able to express their views. I think that's an important point. But the whole thing I said about conscience earlier, of course, the great thing is we believe in freedom of conscience, not just for Christians, but also for others as well. So for me, that belongs in that category. I think the Bible is clear on that. I think when it comes to issues around economics and refugees, yes, Christians can disagree, but what we can't disagree on is the bigger principle, which is we see the heart of God in the scriptures for those who are the furthest from justice, those who are on the margins in society. So Tim Keller's famous Quartet of the Vulnerable, and the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the economic poor. And I think what you need to do is you need to look at that and wisely apply those categories to today. So who are those young people who are struggling the most? Where are the frailest and those who are kind of older, often disenfranchised, and again, so
I think I was going to say about economics. I think economics it's not unchristian to think about policies that will allow a country to prosper and to flourish. The issue is what they do with that wealth.
Yes. Yeah.
And both internationally and nationally.
Yes, that's right.
But I think
because it's the love of money that's the sin. It's not money itself. Greed is sinful. But there's the whole thing in the Old Testament was there was supposed to be abundance, so that you got to a position where the ideal was you wouldn't have any poor among you, even though in the very next chapter we're told that the poor will always be with you. But that's because of sin. So I think you're absolutely right. I think economics does kind of belong in that category at the big picture level.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, James, do you think that there are any parties that Christians really should steer away from? I know you've got to be very careful in kind of naming names and remaining impartial, but I mean, for example, could you ever say to a Christian, don't vote for one of these parody parties, like Count Binface? Would that just be a silly and ridiculous thing to do, no matter how cynical you're feeling? But then, on a more realistic level, are there any other parties that just really would not imbibe kind of biblical values to any extent?
The first thing I'll do is I'll give you the official CARE line on this, which is CARE is completely politically neutral, and we will not advise you one way or the other on any political party. Okay. That said, here's my personal view. I possibly, again, coming back to the freedom point, I think that I personally would not vote for some of the parody parties. I just don't understand why you would do that in your right mind. What a complete... I mean, in one sense, I want to say that's a wasted vote, but I also take the point from some people saying, yeah, but I don't feel I can in good conscience vote for any of the mainstream parties. So I get that. I would do it. I don't think it's a good idea, but I understand why you might. I wouldn't say that was wrong, provided you had approached it seriously and you were doing that with integrity and with sincerity. I think if you're just doing it because you haven't really thought about it and you can't be bothered thinking about it, I actually think that is sin. I think to approach this election without thinking carefully and praying about who you're going to vote for is to sin before God. I would put it that strongly. Yes, I would say that there are some parties that, if you look at their broad offering when their manifesto comes out, clash more with Christian values and Christian teaching than with others. But I suppose, again, we're going to be in the realm of Christians landing in different places on which parties those are. So it's very difficult to say absolute certain. I guess if a party, for example, is explicitly racist and xenophobic during the election campaign, I think it's legitimate for a Christian to say, even if, for example, their economic policy is absolutely stellar, on the basis of their character, I cannot in good conscience vote. It's kind of similar to the tension our brothers and sisters in America are going to face. That tension between policy versus character. And in the last election, 2016, I think a lot of Christians voted on a policy issue and downplayed the character, or just, that was how it kind of ran. Whereas I think in this election, far more evangelicals, I'm not saying that's universally true, but some of the big names who voted Trump in 2016 have come out and said, actually, I'm now kind of putting character above policy. So
I think, by the way, we mentioned tactical voting earlier. I don't think it's a sin. I think it's a judgment call, but I don't think it's good because I think it's negative. I think it's you're basically doing it to get someone out because you can't get them out by voting the person you really want to vote for. And I don't think it allows anyone to be able to count the fact that as a percentage, a number of people voted for this particular losing candidate. I don't think it expresses any support for them. I don't think it's good for them. I don't think it's good for the sort of national statistics of, how many people as a percent voted for each party. So I wouldn't advise tactical voting for that reason. So you just reminded me of that. Sorry, when you were talking about.
No, quite right. That's very good. Very helpful. I think you make a good point.
So we Affinity have a policy of no tactical voting.
Yeah, is this Affinity coming out officially and claiming it's? Yeah,
this is my personal view.
Will Affinity be recommending to all its members who we should vote for in this election, Graham?
No, just who you shouldn't vote for. That's all we're going to do. That'll be really easy. Maybe some people listening to this might be thinking, this is so complicated. These guys are all kind of enthusiastic and knowledgeable, or at least you two are anyway. And they're thinking, I can't get into all this. I'm just going to vote for who I always voted for. Have a little rant at them, James. Or how about encouraging them to go as far as they can?
Yeah, I'd encourage them. You don't need to love politics and find it as interesting as someone like me to take your responsibility to think carefully and to pray well about who to vote for. And I do think, without sounding like a broken record, I do think that, engage24.org.uk is not just being designed and produced for the hardcore of Christians who really care about politics. And because frankly, they'll probably come to the website, but they'll have loads of other sources they're going to as well. Actually, this resource has been designed for a middle-of-the-road Christian who wants to vote, does think it's important, but is in the weeds and might be thinking as you're thinking. I think finding out what the parties are saying in their manifesto is very easy to do, particularly through an election website like Engage24. I think then looking at a Christian analysis, I think involving others in your church can be a good way of helping you think these things through. So I just encourage you, just do the hard yards. You don't need to become a political nerd. You don't even need to get anywhere after the election other than still trusting in God, not giving in to ungodly fears and doubts that actually dishonor God, and also taking your responsibility as salt and light and as a good citizen. So caring about the legislation that's passed. I'm going to say this carefully. I actually don't think that's a really, really high bar for Christians to jump over. I think sometimes we're just not in the space where we're encouraged enough to even think about the fact that that's part of our duty. And the more that we're reminded, this is just what being a Christian involves amidst other things, the more normal that interest in laws, legislation will become.
Just to say that we have other organizations that we're very closely associated with, including Christian Concern and Christian Institute, and they no doubt will be publishing similar things, and we'll enjoy those. They're always quite helpful to jump. So a lot of it is very common because the policies are clearly what they are, so they'll just
Can I just jump on this platform as well, and just to say that ACT have also produced a recording of our event on education policy that we ran with the Christian Institute last night. So that's very particular. So particularly if you're interested in education, if you're a teacher, parent, or anyone just with a godly interest in education, do check that out.
And there will be lots of other sources. How can we pray, either of you? Either of you answer that question.
I'll jump in very quick and say that on Engage24, you will find a 40 days of prayer resource that will really guide you through praying holistically for candidates, for party leaders, for the government that comes after the election, and the whole 9 yards. So that's a great way to help you pray. And it will give you fresh ideas. And my head of church engagement for England, Pete Killingley, is also going to be releasing some prayer videos as well, which again could be perfect for your prayer meetings, small groups, Sunday services. They're not going to be very long, but they'll give you some prayer pointers. So love it, Graham. Prayer, that is a distinctive Christian engagement in this election. Let's be praying for a people who don't pray for themselves.
Yeah. Amen. And do pray as well that we will have open and tender hearts, that we won't be cynical in this process, because that is so easy, isn't it? It's so easy to fall into cynicism and complain, and particularly online, getting involved in vitriolic kind of debate. So yeah, I would say pray for ourselves that we can remain calm, have integrity, and not engage with those kind of negative ways of discussing politics.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just very quickly on that, I please let's watch our language as well, even just our casual language. I don't think we're all going to go out swearing and everything, but I remember Romans 13, we were doing it at a youth Bible study about 5 years ago, and the leader just made the point that if God has given us the government that we've got, whatever we think about how they have done and so on and so forth, you've still got to be very careful about the language that you use. You can use language to criticize without it being sinful. So you can still criticize them, but please let's how amazing that might be to our neighbours and family who are not Christian if even the way we talk about the government, we talk about the candidates, we talk about the parties is just distinctive.
Absolutely. Really good point. Thank you both for at a very short notice coming and doing this. Fear God, honor the King is what we want to do. And hopefully you found this helpful. This was Affinity Talks Gospel special podcast, which hopefully will be useful to you. So God bless you, and you'll hear of us again soon. Thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel